It feels like it's been a while since we last saw SpaceX's Starship fly. And yeah, it really has. But there are actually some pretty good reasons for that. SpaceX recently dropped a kind of wild, behind-the-scenes look at what's going on with the Starship program. So here's a full look at what they've been dealing with while building the latest Starship V3 and what you can expect when this beast finally gets back up into the sky. Version 3 Starship is coming together at Starfactory, a massive facility that's close to 1 million square feet, roughly 93,000 square meters. The whole idea behind it is pretty different from traditional aerospace. Instead of building rockets one at a time like custom projects, they're setting things up more like a production line, turning out both the booster and the ship in a much more streamlined way. Starship itself is a two-stage system. The booster handles the initial push off the pad, and then the ship takes over to continue into space. In some mission profiles, the ship could stay in orbit for up to about 48 hours, and even transfer propellant to other vehicles. Version 3 isn't just a small upgrade either. It's a pretty big redesign based on what they learned from earlier versions, aiming for better reliability and performance. That said, a lot of it is still being proven, and much of the confidence so far comes from simulations rather than real flights. That's why testing plays such a huge role. One of the first big milestones is cryogenic proof testing, where they load super cold propellant, around 80 Kelvin, which is about minus 193 degrees Celsius, into the tanks. This process can take roughly 12 hours and includes multiple full load and drain cycles. It's all about checking whether the tanks, plumbing, and structure can handle the extreme temperatures and pressures they'll see during an actual launch. In a way, it's the first time the vehicle really feels like a rocket. And sometimes, things don't go as planned, even before that stage. Take Booster 18, for example. During a nitrogen pressurization test, something went wrong, and the vehicle was destroyed in an explosion. The good news is that this was exactly the kind of scenario the test was designed for. There were no propellants on board, just inert nitrogen, so the risk was much lower. The site saw minimal damage, and most importantly, no one was injured. After making it through cryoproof, the rocket moves on to engine testing. The booster is fitted with Raptor 3 engines, which are built to be more powerful but also simpler than earlier versions, with fewer parts and extremely high chamber pressure, higher than anything SpaceX has run before. The long-term goal here is pretty ambitious too. Engines that can be reused more like aircraft, rather than the limited reuse we've seen in traditional rockets. The next big step is the static fire test, basically a full system rehearsal on the pad. But instead of lighting all 33 engines right away, they start smaller, with a 10-engine static fire on Booster 19. That's mostly about managing risk. Since this is the first time a version 3 booster is being tested in this environment, they want to limit the potential damage if something goes wrong. And as it turned out, even that smaller test brought some surprises. All 10 engines did ignite and ramp up as expected, but around 2.135 seconds into the burn, a pad side abort was triggered by a sensor. That forced a rapid shutdown, which is actually pretty tough on the hardware. Looking at the data afterward, SpaceX found that about half of those engines may have taken some level of mechanical damage from the sudden cutoff. So they rolled the booster back to the megabay for a closer look. From there, they decided to pull all 10 engines off Booster 19 to troubleshoot the issue properly, while still keeping things moving by swapping in engines from Booster 20. Even with the partial test, they're already pushing things hard, running at extremely high chamber pressures and testing the limits early. It's a pretty aggressive approach, but that's kind of the point. Find the problems now, fix them fast, and keep iterating. Instead of trying to make a perfect rocket before testing, they build, test, break things, and iterate quickly. That's why version 3 is described as a clean sheet redesign. They took everything that went wrong or underperformed in earlier versions and rebuilt major parts of the rocket to fix those issues. But even with that, they openly admit there are still unknowns, because simulations and models can only go so far. With those lessons in hand, they move to a much more ambitious test. A full 33-engine static fire. This represents the complete power of the booster and is a major step toward flight readiness. During the countdown, everything proceeds through the final go/no-go poll, confirming systems like flight software, engines, and ground control are ready.
2 mission.
Wow.
The engines ignite, but again, the test is cut short, this time at about T plus 1.88 seconds because of another pad abort. The issue comes from sensor readings on a ramp manifold that incorrectly indicate low pressure, likely due to extreme vibration and conditions that are difficult to fully simulate beforehand. Despite these aborted tests, the team considers them meaningful progress. Lighting even a large number of engines together and shutting down safely without catastrophic failure is seen as a success because it reveals issues in a controlled environment. Throughout this process, they are also upgrading ground systems, especially after earlier incidents like the Ship 36 anomaly, which damaged both the vehicle and test infrastructure. Protecting the pad becomes just as important as protecting the rocket, because infrastructure takes much longer to rebuild. SpaceX will probably run at least one more full-duration static fire before the first flight, just to make sure everything's really dialed in. As testing keeps moving forward and issues get worked out, it all starts building toward an actual launch attempt. On launch day, things follow a pretty tight countdown. Around T-minus 4 minutes, activity really picks up with final checks wrapping up. By T-minus 3 minutes, propellant loading is basically complete, topping off both liquid oxygen and liquid methane. Then, at about T-minus 40 seconds, control is handed over entirely to the rocket's onboard computers, and from that point on, it's flying itself. A final go/no-go poll confirms all systems are good, and the countdown rolls into ignition. At liftoff, all 33 engines ignite, generating massive heat, pressure, and vibration all at once. If the vehicle can hold together through that initial phase and keep accelerating smoothly, it officially transitions from ground testing into real flight. The mission profile for this flight is actually pretty conservative, and it's meant to be. It'll look a lot like the recent flights, think Flight 10 or 11, because the goal here isn't to push limits just yet, but to safely qualify all the new version 3 hardware in real flight conditions. SpaceX mainly wants clean, reliable data on how everything behaves during ascent, stage separation, re-entry, and recovery before turning things up a notch. Another big change is where it's launching from. This will be the first time Starship lifts off from the newly built Orbital Launch Pad 2 at Starbase. Up until now, every integrated flight has used Pad 1 with the original Mechazilla tower. Pad 2 comes with updated infrastructure and its own launch mount, and it's a key step toward increasing launch cadence, eventually allowing operations from 2 pads at the same time. When it comes to recovery, they're keeping things simple for now. Both stages are planned to go for controlled splashdowns instead of tower catches. The Super Heavy booster, Booster 19, will aim for a soft landing in the Gulf, while the ship, S-39, is expected to re-enter and splash down in the Indian Ocean. Skipping the catch attempt here is very intentional. Even though SpaceX has successfully caught boosters before, this is the first flight with a heavily redesigned vehicle and the new Raptor 3 engines. So instead of taking extra risks, they're focusing on gathering solid data and reducing variables. Typically, they like to see a couple of clean ocean landings first before attempting more complex recoveries with new hardware. It's very much a test like you fly mindset. Prove the system works reliably in a lower risk scenario before moving on. The overall trajectory should follow a familiar suborbital path. It'll lift off from Starbase, go through hot staging for separation, and then the booster will perform its boost back and landing burn before splashing down. Meanwhile, the ship will continue on a high-energy path, getting close to orbital velocity, around 7.8 kilometers per second, before re-entering the atmosphere. That re-entry phase is critical, putting the heat shield and control flaps to the test before a targeted splashdown. It's all about validation. They'll be looking closely at how the Raptor 3 engines perform in flight, how the updated structure and aerodynamics hold up, and how the ship handles re-entry heating with its new design. All of this feeds into the bigger picture, building toward true operational capability, regular payload delivery, reliable booster recovery, and eventually full reusability of both stages. That's kind of the reality of the Starship program. Sometimes things work, sometimes they don't, but that's just part of the process. The SpaceX team is dealing with that every single day as they push into territory that no one's really figured out before. All right, let's wrap things up with a quick update on another rocket. This one from Blue Origin. A lot of you probably saw that their new heavy lift rocket, New Glenn, seemed to have a pretty smooth third flight at first. Liftoff looked clean, and the booster even managed a successful landing on a barge in the Atlantic Ocean, which is a big milestone on its own. But a few hours later, things didn't look so great. It turns out the mission didn't fully succeed. The rocket's main job was to place a commercial satellite into the correct orbit, and that's where it fell short. The customer, AST SpaceMobile, confirmed that its Bluebird 7 communications satellite ended up in an orbit that was simply too low to be useful, meaning it couldn't carry out its mission. So while the launch and landing looked good on the surface, the most important objective wasn't achieved. And that makes this a pretty significant setback, not just for Blue Origin and AST SpaceMobile, but potentially for NASA as well. Even though NASA wasn't directly involved in this specific launch, it is relying on Blue Origin for its Artemis moon program. Blue Origin is one of the companies selected to develop a lunar lander, called Blue Moon Mark II, which is supposed to carry astronauts from lunar orbit down to the moon's surface. The thing is, that lander depends on New Glenn to get there. So if the rocket runs into delays, it adds more uncertainty to an already tight timeline. Right now, Blue Origin has started an investigation into what went wrong, with oversight from the Federal Aviation Administration. Until they figure it out, New Glenn is grounded. That process could take a few months, or longer, and if it drags on, it could start impacting the Artemis schedule in a real way. There's also some confusion about what exactly happened in orbit. According to tracking data from the United States Space Force, the object believed to be the satellite re-entered shortly after. But experts like Jonathan McDowell have pointed out that it's still unclear whether that object was actually the satellite or possibly the rocket's upper stage. So right now, the upper stage is a bit of a mystery. All of this comes at a time when NASA's Artemis timeline is already pretty ambitious. The next major step, Artemis 3, is expected soon, and it involves multiple launches happening close together, including spacecraft from both SpaceX and Blue Origin. It's a complex operation with very little margin for error. So yeah, this isn't a disaster, but it does raise a lot of new questions. And with so many moving parts, any delay, especially with a key rocket like New Glenn, can ripple through the entire plan.